Happy Monday. How is everybody doing? Good deal. Excuse the cough. Today, chapter 5, we go through kind of a huge shift in the paradigm, especially with beliefs. The title of the chapter is called Monotheism. And so it's going to talk about three major religions and their belief in just one God. So up to this point, we've had polytheism, many gods and goddesses. Um, and beliefs were scattered among each one. Temples were built, plays were written. And so when you have many gods and goddesses, monotheism. Oh, you can't hear me?
Now I can. You cut out for a while.
Okay. Well, I'm doing laundry and my washing machine is having a convulsion in the next room.
Yeah, you were lip syncing like Milli Vanilli.
Oh, my favorite imposters. Anyway, I'm glad you can hear a little bit now because such is the internet. But yeah, I'll review briefly before we're going to talk about the three in chapter 5, the three major religions that they discuss. There's a newer textbook I'm looking at that discusses 5. They go over into China, okay? They go into Africa, and they go into South America. And South America is mentioned in here, Central America. Anyway, so the three religions in today's chapter are Christianity, because of the birth of Jesus and the following happening there. And then also Judaism, which actually is, Jerusalem is quite close to Rome. And so you have that particular religion branching off. And then the third one in your textbook is Islam. Now, today we're going to focus on the buildings and the organization of these major religions. It didn't happen overnight, but because the followings were so massive by millions and millions of people, and this change from gods and goddesses to belief in one, it's a huge change. And we still are in those values and belief systems today. But we're going to talk and look at and watch. We're going to look at their structures, their architectures, their buildings. How did they house the religion? And then they have 3 different books, but they're not so different. So the Jews have a book, the Christians have a book, and the Muslims, the world of Islam, has a book that they follow that has stories and some of the same characters. And they have some of the same rules, like commandments. And so as you get going in this chapter, even though the terminology might be a little different, there are ton loads of similarities. And that's where the humanities comes in. Because with conquering certain lands, and you'll see it in a video today, Islam got as far as Spain. Well, there isn't another country besides Portugal after Spain. So they went from the Middle East all the way over to Spain and conquered. And with it brought trade and religious practices. And so in our classroom, we have 3 short videos. Hopefully they show up and you can hear them. They're not lengthy, under the materials for chapter 5. And with this unit, this chapter, instead of seeing differences among these religions, you're going to see how the belief in one God, how things were shared. So if you go to page 127 in your book, there we have Mexico, and we see the sacred city of Mesoamerica, the Way of the Dead. We're going to see the magnificence of this area. And then if you go to 131 in your book, there you will see the Great Mosque of Cordoba. And Cordoba, Spain, was considered a major thoroughfare. Even though it was in Spain, the Moors, they got over there and conquered and built and created during a very dark time in Europe. And so there's a short video on Cordoba and what it gave us and still gives us today. And then if you go to 113 at the beginning of the text, you will see the tomb of Junius Bassus. And a sarcophagus is a tomb. And there you see sculptures in the tomb of Jesus Christ and biblical stories in each one of the squares. The bodies are a little unusual, and the video does describe that. So when we go to the very first page of chapter 5, you see the gilded dome, still in existence, has yet to be destroyed. In the year 120, when the Emperor Hadrian built the Pantheon, the great dome symbolized the unity of a cosmos that was inhabited by many gods. So the Greeks and Romans gave us all these temples for gods and goddesses. 5 centuries later, when a Muslim ruler built the Dome of the Rock at the center of Jerusalem, its dome symbolized one true God who ruled all things. And once this schism, once this paradigm shift happened in world history, it changed the way the world was seen. Even if you're a non-believer, even if you're a Buddhist, it is the belief in the one God. So the idea of one true God who ruled all things, this idea of a single supreme and all-powerful God arose in a minor Near Eastern people called the Hebrews, or the Jews. From Jewish monotheism grew 2 other great monotheistic religions, Christianity and Islam. And by the year 750 had converted or subdued the peoples of the ancient classical world. What we know as Western civilization today grows from 2 roots: the classical spirit of ancient Greece and Rome, which we just covered, and the monotheistic spirit of these 3 religions. And you have to realize that after this chapter becomes the dark ages. So chapter 6 and 7 I combine next week, and those will be the dark ages in Europe. Whereas in Spain, the Islam was thriving. So the plague took a hold of the religions and the peoples in the upper European area. And that will be next week. But the 3 religions played huge part in the humanities. And so with those 3, we will begin with early cultures that had the belief in one supreme God.
We're standing in the archaeological park of the ancient site of Teotihuacan.
We're about 25 miles northwest of Mexico City. The site of Teotihuacan is known as the City of the Gods, the name given to it by the much later Aztecs.
they looked back at what was then in ruins, but thought of it as a sacred city.
Sometime around the year 100 BCE, you have the beginnings of Teotihuacan. And then sometime between around 600, 700 of the Common Era, things start to go awry here. And so when the Aztecs are making pilgrimages to this site much later from their capital city of Tenochtitlan, or Mexico City, they were amazed and impressed. They believed that this was the city where the gods lived, where the fifth sun was created.
And they named this place, and they named the streets, and they named the buildings, but we don't know the original names. So this long avenue was named by the Aztecs as the Avenue of the Dead.
Teotihuacan is a great mystery in many ways. We don't know what language they spoke. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't have a written language that we know of. And even though we do know a lot about the city and the population of Teotihuacan, some of the basic foundational knowledge is lost to us, temporarily, hopefully.
So from what we found, from the art, from the archaeology, from the buildings, we can say that they were masters of city planning, that they built these fabulous temples. But we don't see ruler portraits like we might see in Olmec culture that's a little bit earlier.
What we find here at Teotihuacan are these clear centralized government, whether a single ruler or a body of rulers, it's unclear to us. But whoever was in control had enough power to organize labor to plan on this massive scale, and everything is so standardized. The city itself is very centralized, and it's planned on this grid plan. There was no precedent for this type of highly organized, centralized city.
And so there must have been enough food that was grown and brought into the city. We're talking about a highly organized hierarchical culture that could pull off monumental architecture over a period of hundreds of years.
And the fact that we don't have this cult of personality, that we don't have clear portraits, is kind of amazing. It's frustrating to us today because we want to read into these beautifully complex murals that you find all over the city. We want to see rulers. We want to see narratives that talk about the ideologies that are being conveyed to the population through a ruler or rulers. But what we see in these murals instead are the main deities, some kind of storm god, some type of great goddess, animal figures like coyotes and jaguars and warriors.
And we see a relationship between the monumental architecture and the landscape around it, because as we look toward the Pyramid of the Moon, the shape of it is echoed by the mountain behind it.
Teotihuacanos, as we call them, because we don't know what they called themselves, were clearly planning some of their structures in accordance with the natural environment to almost create sacred landscape within the city itself.
So as we stand here and look out, we see three main pyramids.
We have the Temple of the Moon at the far end of the Street of the Dead, the Pyramid of the Sun a little bit further down to the side, and then the Pyramid of the Feathered Serpent much further down the Street of the Dead.
And the Street of the Dead ran 4 miles, so it's quite long, and it really must have felt like a real procession way toward this sacred building.
If we're on the Street of the Dead, it's about 135 feet wide. And so you get this sense that you're processing down this grand boulevard. It's very impressive to be walking through this city.
It makes the approach to it formal and processional and ritualized. And when we look at the Pyramid of the Moon, it would have originally been even taller with probably wood structures on top.
And we also have to imagine that all of these buildings would have been stuccoed and then brightly painted. So this city would have been extremely vibrant. Off the Street of the Dead, there are approximately 2,000 apartment complexes on this grid plan. A lot of the ones close to the Street of the Dead are more complex. We think that they were for elites, and they too are heavily decorated with things like mural painting.
So we have to imagine something that looks entirely different than the ruins that we see today.
We also have to imagine all the activities here, whether they're ritual or merchants. So only a small portion of the site has been excavated. There are continuing excavations here. Archaeologists are finding amazing things on a regular basis, including a recent discovery of a tunnel under the Pyramid of the Feathered Serpent.
We could know so much more than we know now. I hope we do.
Okay, so that particular one, the picture of it is in your textbook, and there is a brief story. But I want you to take with you how it was organized, how many apartment complexes were built near those temples, how they were built with landscape in mind, and that they're still uncovering information. And again, this one is north of Mexico City, but it lets you know during this particular time how the churches and the belief systems were changing things up as they go into the belief of one God. The critical question on 107 in your textbook asks you this: consider, as we look at three major religions in the world, what, in your opinion, is the ultimate cause of evil in the world? Because even with the Greeks and the Romans and their many gods and goddesses, their polytheism, they still wanted to know why bad things happened. And so how can the existence of evil, when we listen and think about religions, be reconciled with a belief in a benevolent and an all-powerful God? And so the people still to this day ask this question: how can we have evil when we can still believe in a benevolent God? What does the word benevolent mean? Does anybody know? Okay, I'll go back to that question at the end of class. The next area of study is Islam. And I put it at the top because the textbook has it at the end of the chapter. And most of us hear about Islam through media, through television. They are a magnificent religion. They have given the world many, many positive things. And so here's Islam. The Moors went all the way from the Middle East.
Aspen Dental's Everyday Smiles event, where new patients get a full exam and set of x-rays with no obligation, no insurance, no worries. It's free.
Oh yeah, it's all free.
There is one unbelievably amazing site in Cordoba that makes the trip more than worthwhile all by itself. La Mezquita, the Great Mosque. The building is most notable for its vast interior space with 856 columns made of jasper and onyx, marble and granite. Entrance to the mosque is through a gate in the surrounding wall that leads into the vast outdoor patio courtyard. This patio of the oranges traditionally served as the entry to the mosque and has the ablution fountains for cleansing of the faithful on their way in, with some elaborate irrigation, water channels, and beautiful fountains around. The peaceful garden setting is a transition for the worshipers from the daily world into the holy space. We visited with a local guide who helped explain the significance and the history. The mosque was chosen the most important historic treasure of Spain in a major Spanish poll in 2007. When you walk in, you feel transported suddenly into another world, overwhelmed and fascinated, amazed and filled with wonder. There are 19 aisles from east to west and 35 from north to south. The mosque is nearly as large as the world's largest church, St. Peter's in Rome, with awesome dimensions of 425 feet by 570 feet. But the overwhelming size is secondary to the poetic beauty of the design. The map of the mosque can be compared to the floor plan of St. Peter's, both in the same scale, and you see they are nearly the same size. Even if you don't count the open courtyard, the patio of the oranges. The architecture is like a living thing with a canopy of flowing curves above, formed by the double rows of crossed arches, like the interlaced branches of great trees. These double arches were a new introduction to architecture, permitting higher ceilings reaching, in this case, 35 feet high, that would have been otherwise impossible. The double arches consist of a lower horseshoe arch and an upper semicircular arch. Walking through together, we learned there were originally 1,283 columns each with their own different capitals and resting on the floor, sometimes on a base, sometimes not. Some of these columns are believed to be from the original Roman temple, and others were collected from distant lands, and some were quarried nearby. The low ceiling is held up by double arches made of brick and cream-colored stone, arranged in striped patterns that resonate with the pure harmonic energy. One of La Mesquita's great glories is the richly painted mihrab prayer niche that once held a gilded copy of the Quran. The Byzantine mosaics which adorn it are among the most superb that exist. The walls are chiseled in marble arabesques and molded in stucco. Try and get a good look. There might be some people in your way, so just wait your turn and get up to the front and just gaze upon this site. It's something worth a brief meditation. Just have a look. A beautiful gilded dome soars high over the Maksura, which is an anteroom for the Caliph and his court in front of the mihrab. 2,000 years ago, there was a Roman temple dedicated to the god Janus on this site, and then a Catholic Christian church built by the Visigoths. When the Muslims conquered Spain in 711, the church was first divided into Muslim and Christian halves, each party worshiping in its respective portion, because the Moors never denied religious liberty to the conquered people. They maintained a harmony between cultures in those days. 70 years later, the Moors purchased the other half from the Christians and then demolished the entire building in order to build their Grand Mosque of Cordoba. There are historical and cultural reasons why such an amazing building was constructed and has survived for 1,000 years. A building like this does not just appear out of the blue. Cordoba has always been a very important place, and even today it has the largest urban area in the world declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. 2,000 years ago, at the time of Julius Caesar, Cordoba was the capital of the Roman province of Hispania Ulterior. With the fall of Rome, it was conquered by the Visigoths, and then it was conquered by invading Islamic armies in the 8th century. Cordoba became the capital of the Islamic Emirate, including most of the Iberian Peninsula. Surprisingly, it has been estimated that in the 10th century, Cordoba was the world's largest city, and for several centuries was one of the most advanced cities in the world. It was a great center of culture, politics, and finance. At that time, Cordoba had 3,000 mosques, 300 public baths, medical schools, universities, splendid palaces, and what was then the largest library in the world, holding anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million volumes. It had become a center for education under its Islamic rulers. This was a period in the 10th and 11th centuries when the rest of Europe was in the Dark Ages, gripped by feudal anarchy, while the lamps of knowledge were kept burning by the Muslim civilization headquartered here in Cordoba. Cordoba was finally reconquered by the Christians by King Ferdinand III in the year 1236, after 500 years of Muslim occupation. And then the mosque was reconsecrated as a Christian cathedral. Columns were pulled down, the larchwood ceiling was destroyed, and the Christian church was built, very Spanish in its large proportions and wealth of ornament. Although the church is a masterpiece of Plateresque architecture, it's a distortion when one comes upon it suddenly towering up with such a hugeness amidst these slender columns. It really jars one's aesthetic sense. Besides the Renaissance choir, there are 44 Christian chapels around the inside of the mosque. Permission to build it was granted by the Emperor Charles V, sight unseen, and later when he finally visited, was horrified. He said, "You have built here what you might have built anywhere else, but you have destroyed what was unique in the world." Well, this huge church may have just saved the building from demolition during the later Spanish Inquisition, when all things Muslim were being rooted out of society. Somehow there's a uniform beauty and yet variation that's found throughout this magnificent interior. As you wander through the stone forest, it seems you could get lost in the shadows, for the uniform plan is slightly disorienting and you cannot see completely across it because the columns get in the way. The majesty of this celebrated structure, which dates back over 1,200 years, reminds us that Cordoba was Europe's most important city during the 9th and 10th centuries under Moorish rule, when the rest of the continent was slumbering through the Dark Ages. This Muslim civilization kept alive the ancient manuscripts and knowledge and information from Rome and Greece that had been developed 1,000 years earlier, and then carried it literally on the backs of donkeys across the Pyrenees up into Europe, contributing to the beginnings of the Renaissance in the rest of Europe. Who knows, without the preservation of that ancient knowledge, our modern civilization might be much further behind than we are today. The Mosque of Cordoba is a building that one can never forget.
Okay, so that shows you the importance. And if you look in your book on page 129, it shows you how far west Islam did go. And they ended up, if you look at the dark green with the Middle East, but also including Afghanistan, then you have the lighter greens on 129 that are Northern Africa with Morocco and Tunisia. But then you cross over the Mediterranean there at the Strait of Gibraltar, and you have the city of Granada in Spain and the city of Cordoba, which preserved with the 1,000,000 books it had during the Middle Ages. It saved them. All the knowledge that the Greeks and the Romans had built, they brought over from Athens, they brought over from Constantinople, and they brought over from Rome and preserved it, much of it in the Mosque of Cordoba, which still exists today.
Wait.
So while this was going on, Europe was having the plague. It was having the Dark Ages, and the most people ever died because of the Black Plague, which is your chapters 6 and 7. But it's really important in this chapter to realize how knowledge, medicine, engineering, irrigation, arts, and the transfer of the prior knowledge of Greeks and Romans and the ancients, they were carried all the way over to Spain, which many people, because Spain isn't considered a power today, they don't really understand how that all happened. But it was a thriving metropolis. Okay. Have you been there?
No,
Nope.
I'm just trying to figure out how if we're talking about humanities and how we're talking about a world view of things, they like that whole, oh, I don't know. I'm going to go on a big tangent. I don't want to go on a big tangent, but I get what you're saying though. But as far as colonization goes, it seems like the Romans and the Greeks and whatever suppressed the knowledge and the culture of what was Cordoba to bring over theirs. Does that make sense? So
I don't, well, at one time they maybe were suppressed by Romans, but
and
yeah, but Islam is responsible for salvaging the knowledge, for salvaging the artifacts, besides building the mosque. And then you see that the Catholic Church took over the mosque at Cordoba during the Inquisition. So even though Islam really did some preservation going on, in time, the Catholicism took over the space because then Catholicism became the faith of Spain, and they wanted to just get rid of anything Islamic, anything Muslim. But for some reason, it was preserved because
But
the
where's
monks
the humanity in that?
allowed the churches to build because they said you have freedom of faith. Okay. But yeah, I think with every civilization, you are going to have suppression. Oh, yes. That's the dark side. Oh, yeah. But as you look at the map, do you see the how strong during the course of these years till 1400s, the expansion of that? And so not only do you have that influence with art, with medicine, with architecture, all of that, but you have these beliefs in one God that are now sharing similarities, which in today's world with its polarization, have a relief of Jesus. Now, usually when Jesus Christ is put into images, we get a picture of an adult, bearded. In this particular tomb on 113, the depictions are of him younger. And so I'm going to show that video very briefly. And then because of looking at buildings first and how they organized to house their one belief systems, we're going to talk about the three major books. Now, if you know anything about Christianity, you might know that Christians go to the Bible. That is their book. And the Christian faith was split with Martin Luther, and we'll learn about him down the road. And so you have Catholics and you may have Protestants, but they talk about one book that has their stories, that has their commandments, their rules, and the structure of organized religion, which is really important in the humanities because the power of religion in the arts really shows up in the next chapter. The force and the power of control of the arts. And so it's a give and take in the humanities, but today's lesson was really about buildings and seeing how this one belief system was, it was getting a lot of people behind it. And all of a sudden the buildings were being built. And the last one is about the sarcophagus on 113, the last video. And this particular one is short, but it does show you the look of a young Jesus Christ. And we see them sometimes, but many times the image of Jesus is an older male. And so we'll just take a look at this tomb of the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus.
We're in St. Peter's Basilica, and we're looking at a famous early Christian sarcophagus. It's the tomb of Junius Bassus. Now, it's a little complicated because what people generally see is the copy that the Vatican has in their museum. But we're in the treasury, and this is the actual sarcophagus.
And so Junius Bassus was a Roman prefect in around the mid 4th century.
Right, we know he had his position in 359.
So we're looking at a very early moment, soon after Constantine has made it legitimate to be a Christian in the Roman Empire, and Constantine is in the process of, in a way, making Christianity or leading toward Christianity becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire, which will happen in the end of the 300s.
So this is an early example then of a kind of openness and really a magnificent rendering of the iconography of the Christian tradition.
Right, and what's interesting is that it doesn't look the way that we expect it to, in a way, because Christ is here in the center, represented with probably Peter and Paul, 2 figures on either side of him.
It looks likely Peter and Paul, yes.
That he looks very youthful, like a young philosopher teacher.
He's even holding a scroll in his hand.
And he's seated and frontal, although not entirely frontal. So I guess what I'm saying is that things that we normally associate with representations of Christ, where he looks like an emperor who's older and he's got a beard, here he's represented very youthful. Although he's seated and frontal, he does have a kind of naturalism and movement to his body. His left leg comes forward a little bit, his head is slightly turned, and he's got his foot above an image of a river god.
Which is interesting because it shows Christianity surmounting the old polytheistic traditions of the ancient Romans.
Using the iconography of ancient Roman pagan art in a new Christian context.
I really am interested by the point you made earlier about Christ not fulfilling the flesh that we come to expect. And this is so early that, in a sense, those traditions hadn't yet developed.
Exactly.
They hadn't yet been
They had to go all over.
accepted. So this is a very flexible.
Developed, and here he looks much more like a pagan figure.
That's certainly true because of the classical garb that he wears. And it's interesting stylistically because this sculpture is really showing a pretty high-pitched naturalism in terms of the rendering of the bodies, the contrapposto that we see the figure standing in, and even some of the sort of the emotional attributes of the figures.
There is a kind of naturalism, although we see the beginnings of early Christian style. There are some hints of what's to come. The heads are a little bit too large for the bodies. The bodies are starting to be a little bit on the stubby side. So it's a very interesting transitional moment.
We see some other scenes from the Bible, and we're seeing early expressions of it here, but these are ways of representing these scenes that will become very familiar to us.
So we have Adam and Eve
And the
on the
lower register, right.
and also other Old Testament scenes that would have prefigured the events in Christ's life, right? So that idea of saying that events in the Old Testament, such as the sacrifice of Isaac, prefigured Christ's own sacrifice for the salvation of mankind. So that way of saying that Christ's life is a fulfillment of the prophecy and the events of the Old Testament.
What we're witnessing here is the invention of a new iconography. It's the invention of a new visual language for the telling of these critical stories.
What I'm also noticing is just how deeply carved it is. It is essentially a relief sculpture, but the figures are very, very high relief. Some of them seem to be entirely separate from the marble ground. And I love these columns with the capitals and bringing together of the classical and the beginnings of the Christian.
All right. So those were the 3 I wanted to share with you for videos today. But I think that by looking at the buildings, you can kind of see the power and the magnificence and the following of the belief in one God. The sculpture that we just saw of Jesus was 300 years after his death, and still telling an early kind of pre-Christian art, because the church will now start to control what the art looks like instead of looking like the Roman art with the togas. The nudes, oh no, that's coming to an end real shortly. But I wanted to show you the buildings so you kind of get a vision, a look at the magnificence. And so buildings, really important. Monotheism, belief in one God. And then now, before we head out to our Mondays, the books, the rule books, or the books that the believers go to seek answers, to seek knowledge in the beliefs in one system. Well, as I said, Christianity, named after Jesus Christ, has a book called the Bible. Now, when the Catholic Church splits, and that'll be happening coming up, and the church splits into Protestantism, which is the Lutheran faith led by Martin Luther, for reasons, and not all bad, not all negative. But Christianity has a book that they go to for reference, for questioning or finding out the stories, all right? And there are lots of different versions of the Bible. The Bible is in hymns. So if you go to weddings and there's a hymn being played, many of the verses in the songs today are from the Psalms, because the Psalms are very poetic. They're very highly you have in this book have books as well. So you have Jewish tradition. So the Jews in Jerusalem, in the Middle East, also have a book of reference, a book of prayers, a go-to to find out reference about the religion, the stories. It's not that different from the Bible. Does anybody know the name of the Jewish book? On 107, it is described in your book, and some of you maybe have heard of the Torah, and they will hold the scrolls in Jewish traditions. They also have prophets on their list on the Hebrew Bible. Joshua, the Judges, Samuel, Kings, they're all the same characters that are in the Christian Bible. The stories may differ, but the names are the same. And there are newer names, but my goal for you today is to kind of have an understanding that there's a lot of things that are the same. And it's because of what's going on in chapter 5 that you see that people are traveling, that armies are conquering, and these religions are blending. All right. So we have the Torah with the prophets and the writings. And if you look at 107, they have Psalms, they have Proverbs, the book of Job. And so it's very similar to the Christian Bible, the Jewish book. All right, then our last religion, which is the last part of this chapter, although I think they all deserve a chapter on their own. And the artwork, the architecture, the rise of Islam, 129, and then page 130 in your book talks about their holy book. And that book is called what?
The Quran.
Thank you. And so you may have heard a reference to the Quran, but Muhammad's most important act was to receive the revelations of God. Okay, and the whole history of we'll go into it a little bit more on Wednesday. And so he received, Muhammad, prophet of God, according to Islam, received the revelations of God. So he was one-on-one correspondence with God. All right. Recited to him by the archangel Gabriel. So now you have an archangel in there whose name is Gabriel over a period of 20 years. And so the Quran then was created from these revelations made to Muhammad by God. And they're inscribed in the Quran, Islam's scriptures. They're written in Arabic. It has 114 chapters. It blends praise of Allah with wisdom derived in part from Jewish and Christian sources. And that's where we beg to differ in today's world as to the origins of these religions. And it's really important for the arts. And so to have just a fundamental understanding of these three major religions, because there are more, and how that shift in belief systems occurred kind of at the same time, and because of the cruelty of the Romans and those civilizations. So man, in his search for why does evil happen, settled, so to speak, for a one God belief system. Whether you believe that or not, it's interesting in history to view that and to see how it totally changed the world. Okay. Allah speaks directly to the faithful in these in this book. 131, it finishes with the book. For Muslims, I'm looking at my time, only the Arabic version of the Quran is God's true revelation. Arabic became the universal language of Islamic faith and learning. However, as he worked to govern his new community, Muhammad made pronouncements and established new customs that entered Muslim tradition. Reports of the Prophet's deeds and saying. By the 800s, Muslim scholars had defined Muslim law as resting on both the Quran itself and the interpretation and moral example of Muhammad, which really gives you flexibility. By 900, Muslim intellectuals had reached consensus on the foundation of the Muslim way, though questions about the applications of the Quran and the authority still animated the faith. And so those are just basics about the three major religions in the chapters. And I wanted to discuss the book because we could go into certain examples from each, each Bible, so to speak, of the major religions. And then also I wanted you to kind of see how the buildings all of a sudden were being transformed using bits and pieces from Roman temples and Greek temples. But the mosque had its own design, the mosque at Cordoba, and very large in scale, similar to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And so when they showed us the actual drawing of the architecture of the building and how large those two were, they were very comparable, as if somebody who walked at St. Peter's Basilica then went over to Spain and walked the walk to see the length and width of this particular building. And important things for these three major religions. So it's not a religion class, but I think this chapter, I kind of wondered when I first looked at this book last year, I went, well, what are they doing here? But then in order to learn about the Dark Ages and the Renaissance after the Dark Ages, chapter 8, you have to have the shift in human belief systems, and that they were going from many, many gods and goddesses to the belief in the one. Whether, you think that's right or wrong, that's up to you as individuals. But interesting stuff, because it will parlay into the arts in the Middle Ages, the control of the churches. So, all righty, that's all she's got for you today. I hope you didn't fall asleep. Are you still here?
Thank you. That was interesting.
It is. It's fascinating stuff. So have a good night, you guys.
Thanks, you too.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.